China and the United States are not destined for war, because war between China and the United States would destroy not only these two countries, but mankind as a whole. Therefore, I came up with my own theory. It's called inevitability of peace between China and the United States, meaning whatever the problems there are between China and the United States, China and the United States need to engage with each other in peace rather than war. And peace, whether you like it or not, between China and the United States is inevitable.
Hello and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Fiona Edwards and my co-host is Ileana Chan. Every week we bring you this podcast to discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement against the US-led war drive against China, Russia and countries in the global south. Before we get into it with today's very special guest, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you like what you hear, please do subscribe to this channel and click on the bell so you receive a notification when we release new episodes. And if you appreciate our work, you can support us by becoming a member of Empire Watch on Patreon, and the link to this is in the description of this episode below.
We are delighted that joining us today on the Global Majority for Peace podcast is Victor Gao. Victor Gao is the Vice President of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization. He is an expert on international relations at Suzhou University, where he is a chair professor. Victor was also formerly a translator for Deng Xiaoping. Victor, we are honored to have you on our show.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be on your show.
Fantastic. Well, we want to start with the fact that this year marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, following a truly titanic struggle against colonialism and the Civil War. Over the past 75 years, China has risen and transformed from one of the poorest countries in the world into the global economic superpower that it is today. Victor, would you be able to share with us some of your reflections on this journey China has taken over the past 75 years and the significance of this anniversary to the Chinese people?
Thank you very much. We are in the middle of this celebration of the 75th year of the founding of the People's Republic of China back in 1949. Over the past 3/4 of a century, China really has made a profound transformation of itself from a relatively speaking, poor, backward country to modernizing and also very developed country. And by today, China is already the second largest economy if we use official exchange rate, or the largest economy if we use purchasing power parity. And China's development is all encompassing. China has the most comprehensive lines of industries in all sectors, much more so than any other country. And China's modernization is very much based on not only agricultural breakthroughs, but also industrial manufacturing performances. And China's manufacturing output is larger than the next 10 largest manufacturing countries combined. And in 2023, China became the largest producer of automobiles, more than 30 million cars produced in China in that year. And China was also the largest exporter of automobiles, including the largest exporter of EV cars. In a sense, China's development is mind-boggling. And if we look at China and comparing China with India in 1978, China and India, relatively speaking, were on a par with each other in terms of the size of the economy. By today, China is more than 5 times as big as India. So you can see the comparison as well as the absolute terms of the growth in China. And also, China's economic breakthrough is not only achieved in a vacuum, it is coupled with tremendous amount and profound political reform. In a sense, China today is very, very different from China back in 1949, and also very different from China in 1978, when China started the reform and opening up to the world. The significance of China's development is that China could really transform itself and become one of the most developed countries in the world in peaceful means. The implication for the rest of the world is profound. Many other countries, especially those countries in the global south, can learn from China and understand how China has achieved all these developments, and maybe they can use similar models or benefit from China's know-how and expertise in lifting themselves out of poverty and onto the path of modernization in their own way.
I think ironically, though, despite all the achievements that you just mentioned, in the Western media, we hear so little about what China is actually doing domestically. The main thing we hear is basically predictions of how China's collapse is coming soon. That's basically the main heading that we get for China. So I think it's really difficult for sort of the general public that consumes Western media to get an objective picture of what's going on in China. Could you talk us through what's next for China and also the challenges facing China, but also what the next development goals are for China and the plans to implement those goals?
Well, we talked about all those so-called theories about the imminent collapse of China. I've been reading about these theories for the past 40 years or so. So in a sense, I think the collapse of China theory has really completely collapsed because China is not collapsing. China is not peaking in terms of its economic development. And I would say the robust economic growth in China will continue not only for the coming years and decades, probably for another 100 years or so. And our goal in China has been achieved again and again because I used to be an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping. At the end of the 1970s and beginning of the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping kept saying, we quadrupling the size of the Chinese economy by the end of the 20th century. China more than quadrupled the size of its economy. And Deng Xiaoping mentioned that in the first quartile of the 21st century, China need to achieve a level of what he called small comfort. And when he was asked by a prime minister from Japan, what did he mean by small comfort? For example, he said on a per capita basis, it's 1,000 US dollar per Chinese person. China much more than achieved that. China really way achieved that. By today, the per capita income for the Chinese person is about 12,000 US dollar. And making China one of the largest economies in the world. Going forward, I think China is very clear-minded in terms of what it wants to achieve. China wants to maintain stability at home, keeping peace in the world, and put a premium on development. While some people in the United States blame that China has made all these economic achievements by ripping off the United States or even raping the United States or forcing the US companies to relocate to China, allow me to emphasize one point. No single company from the United States or anywhere in the world relocated part or much of their manufacturing capacities to China at China's gunpoint because they wanted to come to China because of the huge market potential and also a very hardworking workforce, highly disciplined, and also the very pro-business environment in terms of the policies and overall situation and connectivity in the more recent years. So I think China is well positioned to really scale up further into the upper reaches of the industrialization and modernization in the world. China wants to transform itself from the workshop of the world into the designing center of the world, from made in China to designed in China, and also in promoting win-win situation, cooperation with all countries, etc. China has already become the champion of free trade, whereas, for example, some other country is very much freaked out by the rapid economic development in China. They wanted to throw wedges into China's economic development. They not only talk about the imminent collapse of China, and since they've been talking about that for decades, and China still stands very firmly and doing very well in terms of its economic development, those who want to believe in such China collapse theories are fooling themselves. So I think going forward, several things stand out. One is that China will continue to be a fierce defender of free trade and free market, and also encourage cooperation with the rest of the world. On any average year in recent years, China's contribution to the global GDP growth is 30% to about 35%. And this is well recorded by the United Nations, by the World Bank, etc. So I think China's continued growth will really contribute not only to the well-being and the welfare of the Chinese people themselves, but also to global economic development. Further, in the world of great tensions and war, for example, China stands firmly on peace, and China will be proven to be on the right side of history because whenever there is a war breaking how China has been calling for ceasefire and negotiations and diplomacy, try to bring the opposing sides together onto the same table, for example. And I believe China will continue to do that. Another point, very important, is that I think China made huge achievement by building up domestic connectivity of all kinds, means highways, railways, high-speed railways, financial connectivity, telecommunication connectivity, internet, cyber connectivity of all kinds. And from the Chinese perspective, when we look outside of China, there are many regions in the world which are not very well connected. So China is really committed to helping many countries in the world, including mostly Africa, Latin America, ASEAN region, and wherever in the world where the local governments and the people would welcome Chinese investments, to help them to build up connectivity of all kinds. Because one philosophical breakthrough from the Chinese experience is that if you really want to build up your prosperity, build a road first. You need to be connected with the rest of the world. And such high quality connectivity projects really contribute to better understanding among the people and enabling countries in different parts of the world to participate in globalization. Some people in the world are now becoming hostile against globalization, but I think we are living in the same world, and globalization is a megatrend that cannot be reversed or fought off, for example. So rather than complaining about the achievements of globalization, we probably need to talk about how to upgrade globalization to version 2.0 or even 3.0 so that people will be able to develop together in different parts of the world by overcoming our unique challenges and difficulties. But any attempt to monopolize development for themselves rather than enabling all countries in the world to develop at the same time probably is a dead end. And China is on the other side. China wants to really promote development for all countries. And President Xi Jinping has been talking about the community of shared future for mankind, meaning all countries have the right to develop. So I think by the middle of this century, that is about another 25 years or so later, China probably will be one of the most developed countries in the world, but still committed to maintaining peace, keeping peace in the world, maintaining domestic stability, and put a premium on science and technology. And by then, I hope the world will be better off and mankind as a whole will be much more better off, because we are already in a multipolar world, and going forward, 25 years from now and beyond, the world will be more balanced, and no single country will be allowed to dominate the rest of the world or try to impose its version of the truth onto other countries.
We wanted to get your perspective on where US-China relations are at the moment. As you know, the US has embarked on an increasingly aggressive new Cold War policy with the explicit goal of blocking the rise of China and attempting to maintain US hegemony. We saw with both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, both of these administrations launched a host of anti-China policies, including tariffs, sanctions, and international smear campaigns. And very recently, the US House of Representatives passed a bill which proposes the US spend $1.6 billion over the next 5 years on anti-China propaganda. And in September of this year, 2024, the US Congress passed 25 anti-China related bills in 1 week alone. And this week was dubbed China Week. Victor, what are the ramifications of this? And why do you think the US is pursuing such an aggressive policy? And what do you think are the possibilities for a different path?
Well, first of all, let's try our best to understand why the anti-China hostility in the United States and in their turn in quite a few other developed Western countries are now reaching a frenzy pitch. As far as the United States is concerned, I'm afraid Washington is suffering from two nightmares. The first nightmare is that the United States worries that China will catch up with the size of the US economy and eventually will become larger and larger and push the United States to the margins of the world development. And the second nightmare, which is even more worrisome for the United States, is that once China becomes larger than the United States, China may start to impose its values, political systems, and ideologies onto the United States, really pushing down the United States to a second-tier country. Now, from the Chinese perspective, no country, no force in the world can deny or deprive the Chinese people of their legitimate right of economic development. And China believes that China's steady economic development will continue. And if you listen to Mr. Elon Musk, for example, he kept saying that by the middle of this century, the size of the Chinese economy will be doubling the size of that of the United States. So from the Chinese perspective, no matter how the United States behaves or misbehaves, for example, China will continue to develop. And the so-called depriving China's access to, let's say, advanced semiconductors will backfire. Each time the United States wants to deny China something or deprive China of something, China will really focus on that particular area and succeeds in making huge breakthroughs. Now, as far as the second nightmare that Washington is suffering from, China will really need to tell the United States in very straightforward and very honest way that either in the past or at present or in the future, China will never impose its views or values or political systems onto the United States. Why? Because China really respects all the countries in the world, about 200 of them, as equals, including the United States. The best way to describe that for the benefit of the people in the world is that China really believes the philosophy that your God for you and my God for me. You don't want to try to impose your God on me, and I will never try to impose my God on you. And the world is big enough to accommodate a successful United States as well as a successful China. And both China and the United States have the duty and the obligation to help all the other countries to develop, especially when we are fast entering the AI world. And if China and the United States do not get onto the same page, probably the final competition, if any, is not between China and the United States, it's between AI versus mankind as a whole. So I think the development of technologies, etc., will dictate that country-to-country competition may eventually need to be re-understood to prevent, for example, AI getting an upper hand against Homo sapien, and they dominate against human beings like we are. So I think between China and the United States is really very much agitated. They worry about losing the economic dominance without fully understanding that in many categories, China is already way ahead of the United States. For example, many people in the US Congress talk about China's shipbuilding. China's shipbuilding capacities is much, much bigger than that of the United States. So if you only look at shipbuilding comparison between China and the United States really need to be fully panicked out because they will never be able to catch up with China in terms of shipbuilding. In terms of automobile production, for example, for 2023, China's production is almost double the size of the American production. And China leads the world in terms of the EV R&D and production. And now the United States not only wanted to impose a 100% tariff on China EV cars imported from China, including EV cars made by American companies like Tesla, for example. Now, the US Department of Commerce even announced that they want to put a complete ban on any software manufactured or designed in China, which will drive EV to be run on a public road in the United States. Basically, they want to put a complete ban on anything produced in China, EV cars or EV car enabling softwares, for example. Now, this is really anti-free trade. This is put the fundamental interests of the American people to the sideline and focus on Cold Wars, for example. However, allow me to emphasize one point. You may know that there is a very distinguished professor at Harvard University who wrote a book about Thucydides' trap, etc. And the title of the book is Destined for War. It's very scary, leading people to think that maybe between China and the United States, there is a destiny that they will end up in a war against each other. I think while I have full respect for that distinguished professor, the book is a complete fallacy. Why? While solid homework has been done to analyze all the previous cases of war, he forgot to mention one thing to mankind, that all the wars he analyzed were conventional wars. And the conclusion you arrive at analyzing conventional wars cannot be readily applied to China and the United States, two largest nuclear weapon countries. Therefore, China and the United States are not destined for war, because war between China and the United States would destroy not only these two countries, but mankind as a whole. Therefore, I came up with my own theory. It's called inevitability of peace between China and the United States, meaning whatever the problems there are between China and the United States, China and the United States need to engage with each other in peace rather than war. And peace, whether you like it or not, between China and the United States is inevitable. Why? Because the other alternative will be Armageddon. So China and the United States, no matter how Washington is unhappy about it, how agitated it is today, they need to live with the fact and come to terms with the fact that China is increasingly a very major factor in the world that they need to live up with, rather than try to derail or throw a huge wedge and try to overwhelm China, hold China down onto the ground as if there is no other consequences. Allow me to add another point to beef up my conclusion about this inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Just a few days ago, on September the 25th, China successfully launched an ICBM test by notifying the United States and quite a few other countries. I understand Australia, New Zealand, and France, and quite a few others put on advance notice. And the ICBM covered a total distance of 12,000 kilometers, landing successfully as scheduled somewhere off to the east of the French Polynesia in South Pacific. Now, China's message is clear. China is able to launch such ICBM successfully, and the distance covered is not only 12,000 kilometers as demonstrated by this ICBM testing, but much more so than that. And China basically can cover any part of the world with its ICBM capabilities, meaning China is a factor to be reconciled and lived with. If you want to impose war onto China, the real significance is that you impose war on yourself. If you want to destroy China in war, the real meaning is that you destroy yourself in war. And by such demonstration, China's message is simple. China is a force for peace. China is a force for peace between China and the United States. And China is a force for peace between China and any other country or any other groups of country. China just wants to urge everyone to recognize that China is a major force for peace. And you don't want to mess around with China by figuring out ways to impose war on China. I think China has made huge transformation of itself over the past 46 years or so in peace. Going forward, China will continue to do so in peace, whereas China will also need to tell countries like the United States and many other countries that China is a major force to be reckoned with, and eventually we are not destined for war. China does not want to have war with any country. China and the United States are destined for peace. Inevitability of peace is the megatrend. And I hope I can mention this to your audience, and I hope your audience will join me in talking about inevitability of peace. And China's economic development will continue for the benefit of the Chinese people, 1.4 billion of them altogether, as well as for the rest of the world. Whereas China will also fully demonstrate without any hesitation and reservation that China is a force to be reckoned with and never try to impose any war or military conflict onto China.
I mean, certainly here at Global Majority for Peace, we love the idea of the inevitability of peace. I mean, that's definitely very hopeful to hear, and we're all behind that. However, I'd like you to get into a little bit of the weeds here with specifically the militarization of Asia Pacific. Maybe that's like close to home for me. But as we're seeing the US militarize Asia Pacific, how does China deal with that? You know, the region, how does China offer a counter to what's happening right now?
I think the United States, in its attempt to seal off China and deny China's access to the rest of the world or to the Pacific, for example, is very unwisely following the traditional way of thinking. For example, the first island chain, the second island chain, and the third island chain, as if, building up such island chains can deny China's access to, let's say, the Pacific or to the rest of the world. allow me to emphasize one point. And I studied arms control and disarmament when I was at Yale Graduate School, pursuing my PhD in political science. And in today's world, if you really talk about a major war between major powers in the world, it's not just, for example, a military war, land war, or a naval operations, for example. It is fully integrated between space and the Air Force, Navy, and the submarine, and the ground forces. So these 5 dimensions are completely compressed into one. And there will be no front line versus the rear, for example. If a major war breaks out, for example, China's ICBM can cover anywhere in North America, anywhere in Europe, anywhere in Asia, for example. And the longer range, China's ICBM can cover any part of the world without any difficulty. And then China has very special way of dealing with its opponents in war. China simply does not want to demonstrate all its capabilities, but China can really identify anywhere, any place in the world and engage that target in war if it is necessary. Therefore, several years ago, when the United States really agitated to such an extent that they launched fighter jets to shoot down Chinese balloon, for example, claiming that that Chinese balloon was doing espionage, let me tell you, China has much more sophisticated ways of understanding every inch of land in the United States. So they do not need to really think that China was forced to launch balloons to engage in espionage activities. The meaning of what I said just now is very simple. China wants to engage you in peace. And Victor Gao has proposed the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Why? Because we do not believe in war. War will be destructive and self-destructive as well as mutually destructive. And war between China and the United States will have no real consequence other than Armageddon. Therefore, when I see the United States try to buttress and lining up the first island chain, second island chain, I really cannot keep chuckling. Why? Because it simply doesn't work. Probably it might have worked in the 19th century or, for example, in the Second World War. But in the world of today, when you're talking about 5 dimensions being compressed into ground force, naval force, and submarines, then you need to really think if you pull a trigger in one direction, your home country, your continental America will be blown up. So what's the consequence of that? What's the fun of that? What's the fun of igniting global Armageddon, for example? Therefore, please join me in my firm belief about the inevitability of peace. And between China and the United States, we need to engage each other. And that's why I really welcome that the Chinese military authorities notified the United States a couple of days before the September the 25th ICBM launch. They basically tell the Americans, if you want to go to my landing site to observe the landing, go there. If you can reorient your satellite to follow the landing of this ICBM, you can do that. I tell you where it will land, and it will land at a designated time. I don't think the Americans were amiss in their work. They probably did exactly what the Chinese side told them to do, and I hope they will be amazed by the result. The point is very simple. Between China and the United States, war is not and should not be an option. Anyone agitating for war between China and the United States is talking about their own demise. Anyone talking about the war between China and the United States is talking about Armageddon. And therefore, between China and the United States, we need to talk about peace. We need to talk about the inevitability of peace rather than destined for war. Therefore, I want to engage that distinguished professor at Harvard to talk about the inevitability of peace rather than destined for war. And I don't think in a nuclear age, there is a real Thucydides trap. There is none. I don't believe there is a Thucydides trap in the nuclear age. If there is one, you jump into that trap first. You don't ask China to jump. China will refuse to jump in because China will stand firm on its own capabilities and on its own philosophy of promoting peace and stability in the world and promoting development to solve all the problems and the challenges, not only for China, which China has successfully done over the past 46 years, but for mankind as a whole, especially those countries in the global south, to get onto the page of development by achieving stability and peace in the world. And mankind need to survive rather than being cursed to another global configuration of war.
Just touching again upon this issue of propaganda, which, obviously you've got relentless anti-China propaganda. And the United States, one of the key narratives that they're pushing, which is related to what you've just been saying, Victor, is they really push a narrative through the international media that China is an aggressor in the South China Sea, that China is threatening things like freedom of navigation, and that China wants war. So how would you respond to these accusations?
Thank you very much. You are raising a very important question, and I think the U.S. Congress or the U.S. government's decision to earmark $1.6 billion to do this smear campaign against China is one indication of their desperation about the steady economic and political development of China. Because this effort is really violating the decency of the American people, because they are really fabricating lies to feed to not only the American people, but people in all the other countries in the world. Now, if you talk about the South China Sea, let me zoom in a little bit. The United States wants to paint China as the aggressor, whereas, allow me to mention, I was trained as a lawyer. I'm licensed in the state of New York. The boundary of the Philippines is well defined, mainly by two historical events. One was the 1898 Spanish-American War, where Spain lost to the United States and Spain transferred the Philippines to the United States. There was this treaty between the United States and Spain, and the territory of the Philippines was well defined in this 1898. Now, Spain transferred every inch of land to the United States as far as the Philippines was concerned, and any inch of land which did not transfer to the United States did not belong to the Philippines. That's number one. Number two was that after Pearl Harbor, Japan occupied the Philippines, and in 1945, Japan unconditionally surrendered, and every inch of land belonging to the Philippines was transferred by Japan to the United States. And every piece of land which did not get transferred from Japan to the United States did not belong to the Philippines. Now, the third point, equally important, you hear a lot about the 9-dash line, etc. That dash line was not created by the People's Republic of China, which was founded in 1949. It was created by the Republic of China in 1947 or so. And when that line was declared, no one rose up to protest about that. In 1945, China was basically one of the only independent countries still standing on its feet, fighting against the Japanese fascists, together with the United States as an ally. And there was no independent Vietnam, no independent Malaysia, no independent Indonesia, and the Philippines was not independent at that time. It was basically a protectorate of the United States, colonized by Japan for about 4 years after Pearl Harbor. Therefore, when Japan surrendered all the islands and atolls and reefs in the South China Sea, and which they occupied completely at that time, after Pearl Harbor and before their unconditional surrender, they surrendered every bit of these maritime territories to China. It's well recorded. The US Navy actually helped the Navy of the Republic of China to reclaim all these islands and atolls and the reefs in the South China Sea. So Washington is pretending that their memory is interrupted, or they do not have long memory, and they only remember what happened in the 1970s, for example. And this is not decent of the US government. They need to really disclose all their archives about the 1898 Spanish-American Treaty, all the clauses, for example. They need to disclose everything about the unconditional surrender of Japan in 1945. And they need to disclose every bit of information about the 9-dash line published by the Republic of China in 1947 or so. Therefore, I think I always tell my Filipino friends, if you really want to defend your territory, defend the territory really you own. You don't want to defend a territory that you claim, but you cannot back up with historical documents, for example. 1898 treaty between Spain and the United States, an unconditional surrender of Japan to China and the United States, Great Britain at that time, and also former Soviet Union, in 1945 were the cornerstones of China's claims in the South China Sea as far as the Philippines is concerned. So China is standing on firm ground, and you also hear a lot about this arbitration. Allow me to mention, as basics of rule of law, arbitration without consent is a violation of rule of law. Why? Because unlike litigation, for example, and you can bring anyone into the court if you believe you have merits, arbitration cannot be conducted without the consent of the two parties involved. So China is not consenting. How can Philippines bring China or drag China into an arbitration? It's against rule of law to start with. Therefore, I think the United States, through the smearing campaign against China, wants to depict China as the aggressor, as the big country dominating against the Philippines, whereas China is really holding very firm on to its legitimate territory and sovereignty in the South China Sea. And if you really want to understand what's going on, as I mentioned just now, go to the library, go to the archives and read about the 1898 treaty and read about the Japanese unconditional surrender in 1945, and you will know who owns what. And China does not need to go further into antiquity because China is the nation in the world which keeps good record. And China's record of navigation or voyages through the South China Sea are well documented through the past 2 millennia also.
Thank you for that. To go back to the topic of globalization again, the US once positioned itself as a champion of globalization, but is now engaging in more protectionist policies and waging an economic war on many countries across the world, obviously including China. On the other hand, China has been on a path of reform and opening up for over 40 years now, and its trading links with countries all over the world have flourished in recent decades. You mentioned before that globalization needs to be, as it probably has a bad name now, and you were talking about how it can be changed to something else, to something new. Can you sort of expand a little bit more on that, on how you see globalization, how it could look for the future?
I would say the world since the end of the 1970s has been in this globalization phase. It was punctured when Donald Trump became the president in 2017, and he tried to disrupt globalization. He tried to put America first. He tried to levy tariffs of all kinds, not only against China, but against many other countries, including its Western allies. However, I would say if you look at the steady progress of mankind over the past several thousands of years, especially since the end of the Second World War and also since the mid or end of the 1970s, one thing is clear. The world is becoming smaller and the world is becoming more and more connected with each other. And not only the internet revolution changed and reshaped the way we live and work, for example, but now, even more importantly, artificial intelligence, AI revolution is happening as we speak. And we talked about the digital divide, but going forward, there will be huge AI divide, not only between countries or between cultures and nations or civilizations, but even between human beings. Right? So we should really be prepared to anticipate and to embrace and deal with all these technological breakthroughs. Now, the globalization changed the way products were made. It involved more sharing of the sample and moving productions to different parts of the world, not for political reasons, not for ideological purposes, but simply for greater efficiency. Because it really means that if you look at the world on a global basis, then there are higher costs and lower costs. There are advantages and disadvantages in different parts of the world. So you really need to think of your production on a global basis rather than purely on a national basis. And the United States, I would say, generally speaking, benefited hugely because of globalization. Of course, they also encountered into their own problems. For example, manufacturing businesses were relocated offshore, and they also relocate other services offshore, etc. And countries like Great Britain, for example, for a while, they wanted to focus on financial services rather than manufacturing businesses. They voluntarily, without being forced by any other country, tried to relocate their manufacturing businesses outside of Great Britain. But they suffered the consequences. And I think industrial planning may be necessary, but industrial planning of any kind should not be excluding globalization. You should really think about how you develop your business. And when I hear some members of Congress in the United States talking about, for example, closing the door of the United States, I really cannot help chuckling again because they don't know what they are talking about. I wonder, they probably have never had any businesses of their own. Their family has never run a business or successful business. So they are only talking about things in ideological terms. And they still believe that the United States is the totality of the world and the American people are the totality of mankind. Things don't work that way. The United States cannot live in isolation of the world, and the world needs to be really integrated into better conditions so that everyone will benefit, rather than, for example, America is first, because the undertone of that is that the rest of the world at the bottom. No one wants to be at the bottom. Everyone wants to be the first, for example. All countries want to be in the first tier rather than in the last tier. That means international cooperation will become more and more important. And no country in the world of today can survive by living in isolation with the rest of the world. So not only from a philosophical point of view, from a pragmatic point of view, as well as really with wisdom and vision and courage looking forward into the future, we all need to re-engage with globalization rather than indulge in the fantasy that you can cut yourself off from globalization. Allow me to really emphasize one point without any hesitation. The world is just one world. Mankind is just one mankind. And you cannot pretend that your country is the totality of the world and your people in your country are the totality of mankind. We need to really believe in this one world totality and one Homo sapien totality. That should be the basis upon which we talk about any business with each other. Therefore, I'm very happy that China is really based on this fundamental assumption and principle that there is only one world and there is only one mankind, and everyone of anywhere, any country in the world are entitled to development. No one is destined to live in abject poverty for perpetuity, and everyone with better circumstances actually has a moral obligation to help out with those people under worse circumstances. That's why mankind is now faced with two completely pathways forward. One is based on China's philosophy, that is, there is one world, one mankind, and all of us should grow together. No one should be left out. And then an opposing paradigm, that is, one country is number one in the world. It should be destined to be the number one in the world, even though it does not work that diligently, for example, and it should enjoy all the perks as being number one for perpetuity. No, things do not work like that. You need to work. You need to really follow discipline. You really need to engage with the rest of the world and try to encourage greater form and higher form of globalization. Rather than, for example, as being demonstrated right now, oh my God, I may have advantages in AI. Let me push the AI frontier to the extreme, and then I will always be on number one versus the rest of the world. No, it doesn't work like that. Because we really want to push that to the extreme, AI will be the dominant force against Homo sapien, and all of us will be subjugated to AI. That's why international cooperation will again become inevitable and crucial in maintaining peace and stability in the world, and also the tranquility of Homo sapien as a species in this world.
As you were mentioning, we have, a United States foreign policy, which I would characterize as based on, like you say, America first, supremacy. The United States has to be number one. And we've seen, a huge amount of suffering that's come out of this policy, so many wars, so many coups, so many attempts to intervene into other countries and violate other countries' sovereignty. But China's foreign policy doctrine is based on something different. The vision that's put forward by China is a concept of the shared future of humankind. So I was wondering if you could explain what this means, and can you share any concrete examples of this different foreign policy which China has?
Let me give you one example. You know, there is a basketball star in China, Xiaoping, whose height is about 2.26 meters. Is that right? I'm one of his millions of fans. I met him quite sometimes and run to him to take pictures with him. But if Xiaoping said, I'm a very successful basketball player, few people will disagree with him. But if he say, I'm at 2.26 meters tall, and no one should grow taller than I am, he will never say that. And he should never say that. If he say that, he will be firmly opposed by mankind as a whole. Because no one can dictate to the rest of mankind that your height should never be taller than Yao Ming. Now, he should not be the ceiling in the world. Sooner or later, there will be people who will grow taller than him, who will become even more successful as basketball players. Is that right? So you'll never have absolutism in certain things. You always have relativity in most of the things, if not in everything. It's the same case for any one country. If you read about the US history, you say, oh my God, US has been the largest economy in the world probably since 1896. And the US has been the dominant power probably since the end of the Second World War, especially the end of the Cold War. But if you say, I'm an empire which will always be on top of the world, and if you read human history for the past 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 5,000 years, you will always come to the conclusion that that is too much of a stretch. You can never do that. Ancient Rome's came and went. Ancient Persian Empire came and went. The Mongol Empire came and went. The Ottoman Empire came and went. The Tsarist Empire came and went, etc. Nazi Empire, claiming to be a Reich of 1,000 years, collapsed in a matter of years. So be humbled with history, be really rational and realistic. If you really want to be long-lasting, always do the good things and always learn from other cultures and other civilizations and always cooperate with others. If you really want to stay on the top, for example, try to bully others, etc., you probably will accelerate your decline and ultimate demise. Now, allow me to mention another thing. I coined a term called the Tonya Harding syndrome. Tonya Harding was a national champion of figure skating in the United States, and she worried about competitor Nancy Kerrigan, and she and her husband and the associates eventually came up with a scheme, whacking Nancy Kerrigan's kneecap, trying to put her out of competition. They succeeded for a while, and Nancy Kerrigan again became the national champion of figure skating in the United States. But when the dust settled, she was banned from figure skating national competition for life in the United States. Now, that's what happened to Nancy Kerrigan. I'm afraid Washington is really doing what Nancy Kerrigan was doing by whacking the kneecap of Nancy Kerrigan, because they suffer from this, what I call Tonya Harding syndrome, because they cannot live in competition with others. They worry about losing their competitive advantages, and they do not want to really decently and elegantly, legally, legitimately engage in competition with the other countries. And they want to whack the kneecap of its competitors, for example. It's not the decent thing to do. It's not the legitimate thing to do. So I would say, Washington, wake up. Don't be seized up with Tonya Harding syndrome. And you really need to demonstrate your decency and legitimacy and honesty and elegance in living as a major power in the world. Not by whacking the kneecap of other countries, but come to terms with the realities and the megatrends in the world. In that context, China is not an enemy of the United States. And the Chinese people are not adversaries of the American people. And based on that firm conclusion, I've been advocating the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Therefore, I'm very much worried about this smear campaign. And I want to tell decision makers in the United States, if you think 1.6 billion US dollars can buy the soul and the conscience of mankind, you fool yourself. Everyone in the world has his or her own eyes. and they can see that the high-speed railways run very properly. And they see China won many gold medals at the Paris Olympics, for example. They see that the Chinese ICBM landed to the east of the French Polynesia in the South Pacific, as they declared, and as they notified Washington to verify. So they need to tell the truth about the ICBM testing. They need to tell the truth about the United States hugely lagging behind China in terms of the automobile production, especially EV cars. They need to tell the truth that China enjoys peace and stability at home, which is the reason why China can afford to achieve such huge, profound economic development. And they also need to tell the American people all the tariffs against the Chinese imports are not paid by China. They are not paid by the Chinese government. They are paid by the American people. And the tariffs against Chinese exports to the United States is one of the reasons why there is high-level inflation, why the living qualities of the American people have been eroded. They need to wake up. They need to tell the basics to the American people, and they really need to serve the fundamental interests of the American people. I don't think the American people want to have a war with China, because if you tell them the truth, they will hate any war with China. China and the United States already had a Korean War back in the 1950s. Why should China and the United States fight another war? It will be really Armageddon for the Chinese people and the American people and mankind as a whole. So by engaging in such smear campaign, the American politicians deprive the right of the American people and the people in the world of knowing about the truth, and they agitate war rather than encouraging peace.
That leads really well to our last question, which is basically, if you do want to know more about China, what would your recommendations be for people to read, watch, listen, to get a better understanding of what is actually going on in China?
Thank you very much. I think the best way is to come to China, visit China, see China with your own eyes. And if you come to Beijing, I'll be happy to invite you to a cup of tea or a coffee. If you cannot afford that, then try to read about China. There are Chinese websites, for example, in English language, of course, and many other languages. Or, for example, call on Chinese embassies and consulate general in your vicinity and try to really understand China. Now, the other thing is try to meet with a Chinese person and try to understand and talk to him or talk to her and really understand China better. Now, I would not be surprised if in any country in the world there are Chinese communities or Chinese restaurants. Go there and experience and taste about China with your own eyes and with your own money. And the other thing is that always read about China in whatever way you can. Now you have TikTok, for example. You have other platforms. You can read about that. And if you read a report in New York Times, always try to do another search in another language and compare the realities. For example, China is the largest engineering country in the world. China managed to build all kinds of roads and tunnels, etc., against all natural adversaries, challenges, for example. And this is very easy for you to read about. If you see a picture of all the tens of dozens of the high-speed railway trains lined up, ready for departure from the stations, you'll be shocked, you'll be awed. And I used to admire the quality of the infrastructure projects in the United States when I was a student over there. Now, I'm appalled by the slowness and the inefficiency of travel by train from Boston to New York to Washington, for example. And then you say, you don't need to travel by train. Stella or Amtrak is not a good way of travel. Drive around, etc. But it's so much polluting, is that right? We as human beings have a duty to help cut down CO2 emission, etc. Trains are better than private cars, much more efficient in a sense. And I will be very happy to see that the United States will be connected by high-speed trains from the Pacific to the Atlantic and from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So in a sense, China and the United States can work. We can help each other rather than getting to each other's jugular. I'm a firm believer in fundamental friendship between China and the United States. And I'm a very strong advocate for peace and stability and inevitability of peace. between China and the United States.
That's great. Thanks so much, Victor Gao. I mean, one of the brilliant takeaways from this discussion is just to get a perspective from China, because we really don't hear from the other side of the story in the Western media. It's all one-way traffic. So it's been really, really interesting to hear about your perspective and China's perspective on, the things that are happening in the world and what the alternative is to this global war drive that the US seems intent on. I love this concept of the inevitability of peace, and I hope that this is exactly what will happen.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And
thank you. Great honor. Thank you. Keep in touch. And if you want to talk about the inevitability of peace, we can do another episode about that, focusing on the inevitability of peace.
Okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just to our listeners, if you have enjoyed this episode or want to get involved in the debate, please do comment, share with your friends, like and subscribe. And thank you so much, Victor Gao. We'd love to have you on again to discuss the inevitability of peace, China's development, and other issues that we just don't hear about in the mainstream Western media. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.